So, our topic tonight is finding your female ancestors, some places and ways to research the women in your family tree. You may find that some of these resources that I talk about are familiar resources, but we may be looking at them in a slightly different way than usual. And also, I'm not going to talk about some of the more obvious places like the census, because that's usually one of the places where people start. But when you are finding your female ancestors, some things to remember are that you need to search for women under all possible surnames. The records are going to be in the surname that the woman used at the time the record was created. So marriage 1 is going to be maiden name to first surname, but marriage 2 is going to probably be first surname to second surname. And so it's just one of those things where you just have to do extra searching for women. You need to also look very carefully at the records for the men in her life. So you're looking for records of her husband or husbands, her father, her grandfather, and her sons. Because many of those, and particularly for earlier time periods, more than 100 years ago, you are going to find that women are in fewer records on their own accord and in more records as Mrs. So-and-so. So, for finding women, you do need to understand the rights of women in the time period and place where they lived. So knowing that in many times, more than 100 years ago, in many places, a woman is going to be what the law would consider femme covert, meaning as one with a spouse. So when she married, her rights went away and her husband was in control of all of the property and everything. Unless she was acting as a femme sole, S-O-L-E, and a femme sole is usually a spinster or a widow, but sometimes a woman who is a businesswoman or has filed or put it out that she is operating independently of her husband and her property cannot be used for his debts. You sometimes see it where the man is a gambler or something like that, and she happens to be a seamstress, and so you may find a woman in records on her own accord, but knowing the time, place, time period, and the location, you may find that some things fit that, or you may find an exception to the rules. One place that you will find women, and this is true throughout the centuries, is church records and organizational records. For many time periods, the women may not be in government or have their own deeds or their own wills or various things. But women's organizations and churches have always been places where women played prominent roles. So you will find them on membership lists and things like that. And which organizations the woman is in can tell you a lot about who that woman was and the socioeconomic status of that family. You will want to search for family papers such as letters, diaries, scrapbooks, photographs, because these are places where women typically are the letter writers. Women are typically the ones who make the scrapbooks. I say typically, my grandfather made his own fair share of scrapbooks and photo albums, but my grandmother made the lion's share of the 40 plus scrapbooks that I have inherited from that side of the family. So the other thing to remember about women is they are often the creators of the material history. And material, although this slide has material things, meaning the tangible items as opposed to the written record. So on this slide, we have a crazy quilt that my grandmother made out of fabric from various family clothing from various eras. This particular brown and gold and black plaid, my mother had a cloak that she wore over her square dance dresses out of that material. So I have strong memories of that because my parents square danced regularly when I was a child. This cream colored Afghan is a partially finished crocheted Afghan that my great grandmother Rouse was making and did not finish at the time she died in the 1950s. But it is a beautiful piece, and through my childhood we kept it folded, and it was on the back of the love seat in the living room, and so it was a connection to that side of the family. This is tatted lace. Actually, this may be crocheted lace, sorry. Crocheted lace on some pillowcases that were made for me by one of my other great-grandmothers, the only one I actually met. And so that's special. It's pink. My room was pink when I was a kid. So other types of material history that you may not think about, but you need to think about the stories that have been passed down with these objects. Jewelry. Jewelry can be a very strong indicator of what is important to the women in your family. You may find pearls, a charm bracelet. This one happens to be mine, so it's not old. This was my grandmother's heart locket necklace, and as the only granddaughter, I got it. This was a pin my other grandmother, my mother's mother, wore often. It's costume jewelry, but it's still beautiful, and it's nice and holiday seasonal. And then these are clip-on earrings, rhinestone earrings that my mother wore for high school events. So it's interesting to have those and be able to know some of the stories about it. On the right-hand side here, in the mason jar, you will see buttons. These are the buttons and some of the trimmings that came from at least two of my great-grandmother's sewing kits, and I think three, as well as my paternal grandmother's sewing kit. And so my mother decided at one point that these would be a whole lot more useful and pretty and a conversation piece if they were in one of these ball jar lamps. And so that has been a really nice thing to have, and I look at it and have memories, and I'm not chasing buttons around the house. This little painting was done in 1952 by my grandmother shortly before she passed away. She had severe rheumatoid arthritis, and her hands were very twisted up and crippled. So the fact that she was still able to paint in that last year was actually quite special. And this painting has been in my bedroom for my entire life. So it's these types of connections with the women in our past that we sometimes don't think about, but that can be very special and very meaningful as we think about who they are, what their lives were like. Other parts of material history that are more associated with women than men would be the silver and china, the glassware, other decorative items, furniture. And in this case, this is my great-grandmother, who I am named for, Charity, and that is her squeeze box, and it is, or accordion. It is circa 1900, probably from the Sears and Roebuck catalog. I know from catalogs that I've seen of that era, they sold this brand and similar to this. So these types of things, do they play a musical instrument? So at some periods that was expected of women of certain class demarcations, but also was music a part of their life? Various things. What style of china did they pick? That can tell you some about who they are. So it's things to think about that are not documents. And sometimes we forget to think about things that aren't documents because genealogists are very focused on documents. Other more document than not, but still more in the material history, you may find cookbooks. This is a family cookbook. I have a pound cake recipe from that I use. This is my great-grandmother's hymnal, one of 3 hymnals that I inherited from her, and she was very clear. It is Mrs. Carrie A. Rouse's book, and it's a 1924 hymnal. This is a school history that was written about the school that my grandparents went to, or my grandmother went to as a child, my other grandmother, my mom's mother. And in the scrapbook, there is a wedding program. So you may find things like wedding programs and bulletins from church services and those types of things that will give insight. Why did they save it? It was important for some reason. And so sometimes with women, you have to get a little crafty and come in from a side perspective. But you may be looking for things like scrapbooks, again, event programs, and these other types of materials. And just for kicks, the background there is an embroidered doily. And I have these. I'm not sure that this one is a family one. I think this came from a friend of the family. But these types of handwork can be an important link to the women in our past. So, enough about material history. Let's take a look at some of the places to look at, and these are the ones we're going to look at a little bit more in depth tonight. This is not an exhaustive list, and I'll have another list at the end that has some more places to look. But as we go through these, you do need to remember to check these for the women, for her spouse or spouses, for her parents, and for her children. And so, because a child's marriage record may name the parent. And so at various levels. So we are going to look at these types of records, and we're going to look at them maybe from a little bit different perspective. So these are 2 examples of marriage records from Virginia. Most of my family is from Virginia. And also South Carolina. I can't even prove my great-grandparents got married in 1902, other than what it says on their tombstone. So South Carolina didn't start keeping records for marriages until July of 1911, births and deaths in 1915. So Virginia and its long tradition of marriage bonds has been a lot more helpful for me as I have been researching those parts of my family. On the left, the handwritten document is a 1798 marriage bond and permission, because it's a 2-part deal. The permission is the little chunk at the bottom, to marry, for Tabitha Martin to marry James Gardner, Franklin County, Virginia, 1798. James Gardner is one of my Revolutionary War ancestors, and he had been born in New York State, served in New York and New Jersey regiments during the war, and moved down into Virginia. And so this marriage bond is filed with the court. The bulk of my Virginia people are not Episcopalian, which was, or Anglican at the time, was the State Church of Virginia. So they filed their records with the county clerk rather than the church. And then the permission down here has me curious. Either, well, it's not a mother named Tabitha, but in May of 1798, this is to satisfy that I, Tabitha Martin, doth and has give consent for Mary unto James Gardner, and it's signed. Everything I have found says she was probably about 18 at that point, and knowing marriage laws in Virginia for that time frame, you had to be 21 to be married in Virginia without permission of parents. So it may be that Martin is a married first name and she's already been widowed once. I don't know, but why there isn't a parent doing the permission, or a guardian, I don't know. It's another question about that. But that I did the genealogy happy dance when I found this document. On the right-hand side, you will see a more recent certificate of marriage. This is for my maternal grandparents in Rockbridge County, Virginia. And it tells all sorts of wonderful information about their employers, where they were born, what their parents' names are, and all of that kind of information. So again, look for their information to give hopefully the name of the parent, or look for their children's marriages or death certificates or things to give the names of the parents. So be sure to trace the generations up and down as you can. Divorce records are another thing that can help track name changes for women. This is not from my family. While Virginia does make divorce records that are more than 25 years old open to the public, I don't have permission to share any of those of living people. And so I just picked 1918, which is the first year that they did this statewide form, but prior to that it was on a county level. This is divorce certificate number 1 for Virginia. And you can get a lot of information from something like this. The full Minnie Ridgway's name, the husband's full name, and no children. And so it's giving you at least some information. And he is suing for desertion, which is kind of interesting. Do check for divorce laws, because South Carolina did not allow divorce until 1950, except for by a vote of the legislature. So there were many separations, and then people just kind of remarried, but maybe not totally legally, because they were never legally divorced, but they may have also gone into a neighboring state or to Florida to get divorced at some point or other. Nevada is another place, and Mexico is another place that people often went to get divorced, but Florida is a whole lot closer to South Carolina. So if you're not finding the documents you expect, do check into what was the situation for that in the time frame. So birth records, in South Carolina, birth records started to be kept in 1915, which means my paternal grandfather, born in January 1914, does not have a birth certificate. And the birth certificates more than 100 years old have been released, well, some of them, and those are available through the South Carolina State Archives. This is going to differ state to state, so take a look and see. Often the vital records, whatever office does vital records in that state, in South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control, will have information about, for birth records of this era, please see the state archive or the state library, or Virginia has partnered with Ancestry for their public records. So it just depends. But this is a standard certificate of birth in 1915, I believe. Yeah. And so Henry Franklin Rouse, not on my direct line, he may be a relative. He is Negro, but he's Darlington County. So, my Rouses came from Darlington County. And so you get the certification from the various midwife or doctor about the birth. On this, there's also an affidavit because there was some confusion on some of the details. And so in 1944, they amended and said, hey, no, this is what it was. So always look on the back of things. If you've got a certificate, check the back, make sure there isn't more information on the back. Death certificates and birth certificates do usually name the mother. So, that's kind of helpful information. Death certificates will often name parents. This is my second great-grandfather, John J. Rouse, one of 3 out of 4 generations named John J. Different middle names. He's a James. The other 2 are Josephs. But you get information about John here, and you get death information. You get information about parents, and that mishmash of writing and writing over is ROBTA, Robert A. Rouse, born in Chesterfield County, South Carolina, and Elizabeth McDaniel, Darlington, South Carolina. This is one of the few places I have her name. I have hit a whole big roadblock with her, so it's interesting to know. Now, the person who's giving the information is Mrs. Walter Bethay. That is actually John's sister. So you need to know, who the women in your family married, because that is better information than, the second wife giving the information, because she didn't know him when they were kids. Actually, well, maybe she did. But anyway, so look in different places. You may also see women in these local registrar or in the undertaker line. More of those in the 20th century than the 19th, but still, it's a good place to look. Do check for certificates, death certificates for all children in the eras that death certificates were issued, because you may find differing information. And so it's just one of those things where check, because I have a series of death certificates that the informant, it's 1 generation down. The informant is the same informant on 2 or 3 death certificates, and they gave different information on each one. I'm not a huge fan of Great Uncle Ronald. But anyway. So related to death, we also have probate records. And so probate records are helpful in wills. Wills often name the extended family members. And one of the reasons why I mentioned grandfather in the early part of the program is you need to check multiple generations, particularly if a generation between may have died prior to the person who is leaving the will, because many times it will say, to this child I leave this child I leave this, and to the heirs of this child I leave this, and then it will often name those heirs. And so that will connect 3 generations right there for you. This is a record I found on the South Carolina Department of Archives and History website, in their online records. And I was, quite frankly, sitting at the desk in the Kennedy room one night, and didn't have patrons in, and decided, okay, let me explore this search. And I put in Thompson Allen, who is my great-great-grandfather. And anyway, lo and behold, this pops up. This is the will of Amy Pittman in 1852, or 1848, sorry. And I can't find her husband's name, but I certainly have her documented. And I know she's the mother of Rhoda Thompson's wife, and it lists a number of their slaves. So this is an example that crosses over between women and a topic I talked about in February with African Americans. Probate records will often tell us more details about that family. And in the South, one of the things we have to deal with is that African Americans were owned as property. And so it is a little bit difficult sometimes to grapple with, but we have to deal with the documents as they are given to us. And just in case you can't see it all that clearly, I highlighted this part of it because it gives some important types of things to be looking for. So, and again of my Negroes I give and bequeath to my daughter Mary Pittman, my Negro man seer in Mississippi. Under the management of my son Newitt Pittman, I give this Negro to my daughter Mary for her use and benefit during her natural life, subject to the management and supervision of my son William Pittman, and at her death to return and be subject to the disposal hereafter made. But if my daughter Mary shall have issue of her body, then the said Negro seer to remain with her and her issue forever. And again I give and bequeath to my daughter Mary Pittman, my son William Pittman, to my daughter Rhoda Allen, wife of Thompson W. Allen, to my son Thomas Pittman, and my daughter Sarah Ann Rogers, wife of Dew Rogers, my Negro woman Tenna, my Negro girl Catherine, my Negro boy Jerry, my Negro girl Lenny, and Negro child Sear, and all their future increased together with all my personal property of all kinds and descriptions. So, in just this little paragraph, we learn a whole lot about this family. One thing is, part of the family is in Mississippi. And so, if you are only looking specifically in South Carolina, you might miss the children who might be in Mississippi. You also have an indication here. Now, this is slightly unusual because it's a mother's will, and usually the mother doesn't have the property. Usually the wife inherits a life tenancy and the right to dispose of limited personal property, but not a lot of property. However, Amy has significant property of her own in this case. But you get life right for the wife. So sometimes probate can really go a long time. And so you may find probate cases 40 and 50 years after the original person dies before it's completely and totally settled. So if it's after the date of death, do check that record just to make sure it's not an ongoing probate case, because the ones that last longer are the ones that give you so much more information. If it's a cut and dried, easy probate case or a trust situation, it's going to be not a whole lot of information. But if somebody dies without a will and the court has to decide how to break up the estate, or if there are strong concerns about one child or another mismanaging the inheritance, then you're going to get a lot more information. Okay. So Another thing to look at will be land records and dower relinquishment. Now, this is one place where South Carolina did do us a large favor for women. South Carolina required dower relinquishment as a protection for women until 1985. We were one of the last, if not the last, states in the nation to do away with this practice. And basically what a dower relinquishment means, this is the practical definition anyway, is that a man was not allowed to sell property without the wife being questioned separately in another room by an officer of the court to make sure that she was okay with the sale. And in early years, when women couldn't really own property on their own, except for with a few exceptions, it was a protection that the man could not just sell all of the property out from under the wife and then desert her. The state didn't want these women to be wards of the state. They wanted them to have enough property for themselves. So this particular document is a dower release from 1884 for Harriet Bethea, and her husband, John Robert Bethea, is deeding land to Louis Bethea in Marion County, and Louis is their son, and this is one of a series of land deeds that are happening in the family. But so John up here is saying, hey, we've sold this is the deal. And then clerk of court saying, okay, W.W. Sellers came by, said, hey. And then D.W. Bethea, the judge, that he has talked with Harriet Bethea and made sure that she is okay with the sale of the land. And she was. But this was a protection to help women. So, other places that you can often find women that we may not think about, and there are certain places in newspapers that we think about. We think about looking at the obituaries and death notices for, again, parents, children, the person themselves, the spouses, the grandparents, grandchildren, siblings. So look for the people around the person you're researching. But do you often think of the society pages? This is my aunt. She won second place in a talent show when she was in high school. Over here, this is an obituary. And the obituary tells me a lot about my great-grandmother's sister, that she was called Miss Epp instead of Ethel. I didn't know that. She was a lifelong resident of Latta, South Carolina, and for many years with her sisters operated the Allen House, known for home-cooked foods from New York to Florida. That's the pound cake recipe I have is from the Allen House. And it talks about where she was a member. So she was a member of Latta Baptist Church, also taught school for several years at Balco Schools. So that's another place for me to research to find out more about what ages she taught and what was that school. And then there are two surviving sisters and a brother at that time. My great-grandmother had already died. And my great-grandmother helped run that Allen House, boarding house, the best place to get lunch in Latta, I am told, from the 20s through the 50s. And so that was a fun find. In some states, like South Carolina, you will find articles and things specialed up to the state newspaper. In other states like Kansas, they'll look at you like you're crazy if you ask that question, because they don't have that type of paper in Kansas. So, ask and check out what you've got for the region that you're looking for. You may find feature articles. There is a feature article that I came across in my papers the other day when I was looking for something else about the Allen House and the three sisters who were running it in the latter years. You may find birth announcements. Often it's just baby girl or baby boy and the names of the parents, but sometimes you get a whole lot more information. So that's going to depend on the time, the place, the social prominence of the parents. But it's worth a check. Marriages. Marriages often get write-ups, and so sometimes you find out exactly everything that was on the menu, and other times you may find so-and-so and so-and-so got married. It just depends. Depending on what your ancestors and family members were into or not into or victims of, you may find them in the police and court reports. Those actually lead to a lot of good documents, so they can be highly entertaining reading. They can also be, oh my goodness, I am so embarrassed. Or, obviously we can't change what our ancestors did, so they were all human, and some people do things we wouldn't agree with. You may also find advertisements for businesses or advertisements for settling of estates and those types of things that can give you clues on where to look for court records. And then land transfers. Land transfers are usually placed in the paper, whatever the paper of record is for that area. And so that can also help if for whatever reason you're not finding a deed that you think you should be finding. Those can often provide another clue, or if records have been destroyed at a courthouse for whatever reason, flood, tornado, fire, etc. So those are some things to look at with newspapers. Court records. This is an example from Virginia, and it's Chancery Court. Chancery Court is similar to Equity Court here in South Carolina. Most states had some sort of court of this type. And what Chancery Court did in Virginia, is when an estate was pending, and particularly if they were having to wait until the youngest heirs got to 21, and that was going to be 20 years, or in the case of this case, the wife, Margaret, inherited her half of the estate. 3 other women and their children inherited the rest of it, but the husband, deceased, who died, his will just stated that his wife had life rights to the property in the will, land and enslaved, and did not specify, which was the standard, was to specify until death or she remarried. Well, she remarried at least twice after his death in 1832. And so in 1835, they're already in Chancery Court because the other heirs wanted an injunction against Margaret to make sure that she wasn't going to try to do something underhanded and sell property out from under the rest of the heirs. And then in the 1853, I think, is the second case. And it's just one of those things. Francis only could have kept everybody from having a lot of headaches by just saying, or until she remarried, but he didn't. And so you get a lot of information. There were 4 slaves involved, and by 1834, Southey, one of the slaves, who was hired out, and then the income was collected and divided by Margaret to the various heirs. He was hired out to Henry Mills, but he escaped. So they're just kind of saying, hey, we can't have all of these runaways. We're dependent on this income. And then another really cool thing about Chancery Court cases, and these are many of these are online at the Library of Virginia in their Virginia memory section. There's a whole section of Chancery Court cases, and it is all a written testimony case. So there was no verbal testimony. It was all you wrote stuff down and had it notarized, or you went to the clerk of court and they wrote it down for you and notarized it, and then it went to the judge. And so written testimony can be very helpful. It can also be a royal pain and a half to read. You can see the ink that is coming through that page from the other side, making it difficult to read both sides. Ink is faded and that kind of thing. But hey, it's very helpful information if your family happened to be the family that created those records or had those records created. So, church and organization records can be very helpful for women. This happens to be an early ledger of the Kennedy Library Association in Spartanburg, which was our library's founding organization. And this particular log started in January of 1888. One of the very frustrating things for women is this Mrs. Elsie Kennedy here at the top of the page. She is the benefactress of our library. She started the library. The idea of the library came as, what is our legacy? Her husband, who was a surgeon in town, physician and surgeon, passed away in 1880, and they had no children. So she was left to figure out what to do with their estates, all of that information. And so she chose to found the library. But that doesn't say Helen Fasu Stevens Kennedy. That says Mrs. Elsie Kennedy. So sometimes you're going to have to deal with all of these initials, and they're his initials, not hers. I have not been able to do as much looking at this book as I would like. I'm not sure. I would assume 1892 may be, and 1898, these may be years that either these women joined the Library Association or left the association. And I would say it's probably joined, that this was a book that started in 1888, but then was kept for years after that. But some, down here you do see a Miss Mary Moore, and so sometimes you do get the woman's name. Most of the time you get Mrs. whatever the husband's name was. Also, look at church records. Church membership records are a great place to find out women's names. Missionary societies and women's mission groups for churches, because they were founded for women and by women and run by the women, they tended to keep notes. And so sometimes in their minutes you can find a lot of helpful information about the women in the church. Sunday school records as well. Family records. Now, the image here on the left is not from my family. I unfortunately did not inherit any family Bibles, but this is one courtesy of the State Archives of North Carolina via their North Carolina Digital Heritage Center, and it is from a Horton family. One of the things that is notable about this and why I pulled it is it's actually a list of the slaves that family owned, their births. And so sometimes you can find unexpected information or information about people who you might not expect to find information for in a family Bible. So make sure you ask that question and look for that information, because that's really super cool if you are one of the people in that greater family unit. On the right here, I was looking through a scrapbook of my grandmother's and found in 1971 where she had her brand new pass. And she is Mrs. W.E. Lawhorn, love those initials, wife of conductor. My grandfather was a conductor on the passenger rail lines, and so for Norfolk and Western. And so this was her train pass that she could travel. My mother tells stories about being a child, and grandma or granddaddy would walk her the block and a half to the station. Actually, I guess it's 2 blocks. It was a block to the school and then the block to the front street. And put her on the train with her lunch, and they would have let her grandparents, my great grandparents, know she was coming. And as the train went through Cornwall, great grandma would have thrown the little flag down to say, hey, stop here. And mom would hop off the train and go visit with her grandparents. And then when it was time for her to go back, it was in reverse. Great grandma would flag the train down, put mom on the train, and send her back to Shenandoah. And so these types of train passes, maybe I didn't know at some point that granddaddy had worked for the Norfolk and Western. So this is a good clue to family income and why they lived in Shenandoah. It was the crew stopover spot between Roanoke and Hagerstown. Military records are another great find that we don't always think about to look for women, but particularly widows can create a lot of records in the military record area. On the left here is a Pension Act of 1919, and she is certifying, Sarah Jane Gardner here is certifying that Evander McIver Gardner and his company information, and that she is living at the Charleston home, the poorhouse in Charleston, since 1912. And so she is applying for the pension. Evander Gardner actually died of wounds sustained in 1862. And so in one of the battles near Washington, D.C. And so she was a widow for a very long time. She had lived with her daughter in Charleston for quite a few years. And then after the daughter died in 1906, apparently she got turfed out too, and especially once he remarried. So she was in the poorhouse in Charleston and applying for the military records, or the pension. On the right-hand side here is a War of 1812 pension, and Nancy Bobbitt, widow of Caleb Bobbitt. This is a very long War of 1812 pension document, and these are available free online at Fold 3. The War of 1812 pensions were funded by the National Federation of Genealogical Societies and some other National Genealogical Society and other groups, so that they would be free and online there at Fold 3. She got turned down twice. So she went through this whole application process 3 times. She had to write back to Virginia from Missouri to get the marriage affidavit from the clerk of court and various things. I mean, luckily she was married in Virginia where they kept that kind of record. I don't know what South Carolina people would do, because I can't even find 1902. But this was a lot of really good reading within that file to find out information about the movement of the family. My one ancestor who actually that couple, and every child but my direct ancestor, one son stayed on the home place in Virginia. Everybody else moved west. So my family was the homebody family of that particular line. So other places to check would be immigration and naturalization. Naturalization only after 1923, or if they were single and adult prior to that. The Cable Act changed how women were naturalized, and so that made a huge difference. Voter registration, obviously post 1920 in most areas, although some places like Kansas allowed women to vote earlier in non-federal elections. So do check for local election registrations as well. Sometimes women were allowed to vote in school board, but nothing else. It just depends on the location. But take a look at that. But 1920, because we're celebrating 100 years of women in the United States being able to vote, it's kind of important. Do look at federal and state censuses. Those can be very informative. And then occupational directories, such as school directories for teachers, because that can be a great resource for people in that field. Yearbooks, again, students, teachers, administration, for the 20th century primarily. City directories, if they are available for the time period and location where your ancestors lived, feel free to take a look at those city directories because they can tell you a lot of information. There are who's who type books, who's who in American women of the South, and who's who in writers and authors, and etc. So take a look at those, particularly if a woman had some kind of prominence in her given field. But also check that for the husband, because often the husband's bio will name the wife and the children, siblings, those types of things. And then county histories do often refer to them as Mrs. So-and-so, but again, it can help you put that woman in a place at a time with potentially children and other family. Cemetery indexes, and then church rolls, minutes, and newspapers. Church newspapers, again, along with with the notes of mission societies and things, often do have marriages, births, deaths, and because women, even though in many church denominations women were not allowed to be in leadership roles, professional, it's the wrong word, clergy roles, but in lay leadership roles, they are very prominent, and so often get named in those newspapers, or it'll say Mrs. John Smith and the women of name the Methodist Church raised this much money for this mission cause. And so you can get an idea for different projects and things that were important to the women. So, and I am going to